CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 3, Part 10, Audio, by Renee Matthew. Different products were imported by the people of Europe from different places. We saw what all were imported, which included all these things. The furs, tin, commerce and craft was building around the place by the 12th century. Everybody was growing. Everything was growing at a rapid pace. And earlier what happened is the craftsmen used to travel from manor to sell their products. But now that was not needed with the development of the town's hall square. We also saw how the town's hall actually elaborated. It expanded where people used to gather in guild forms and also as trade merchants. Now it was very easier for them to settle in one place where people will come to them and purchase the goods, and they were able to sell at a large scale. So carrying all these things from one place to another was very difficult, but now it is like they could do it just by sitting in one place. So as the towns grew, the trade continued to expand. So only if the towns grew, they could have these towns hall square or these kind of trading points. If the towns were not there, if only manorial estates were there, of course trade will not expand. So now the merchants became very rich and powerful, and they started rivaling the power of the nobility. They started being a threat to the power of the nobility because one major reason is because they had the money. The second thing is they became rich, and also the status of their life was also increasing, like they are growing from the normal status in the society to the richer position. So that was a big threat to the nobility. Okay? We need to look at the cathedral which were established in the towns, because in the village, do you remember the diagram which I showed you in one of the previous audios, where in a manorial estate you have a church, then you have the manor house and all the other field and the dwellings of the peasants were also there, right? But now what about the cathedral which got built in the towns as the towns expanded? So we still have lot of remains of cathedrals from the medieval Europe. Even now it is maintained by the government. When you go abroad to different places, you can have a look at all these construction. And that is totally different from how the churches or buildings are constructed now. Modern construction is totally different. So one of the ways in which the rich merchants, so these normal peasants only started becoming rich and they reached the position of becoming a merchant. They started spending their money by making donations to churches. When they had money, they started donating to church. So what happened from the 12th century? Large churches. Earlier it was only church. Now when it was huge church with so much of architecture, with so much of investment in the building and the structure, it was known as cathedral. Cathedral is a huge form or huger version of a church, and that was built in France. Of course, the cathedrals belonged to the monasteries, but different groups of people started contributing to the construction of this. Like labor was different, and people who had money also contributed to the building of these cathedrals. And of course, they had materials and money and all these things by constructing it. Okay, so it contributed to the construction with their own labor. And some of them even started donating materials and money to the construction of this cathedral. And you should remember that the cathedrals were initially built of stone, and it took so many years for them to complete one particular cathedral, and lot of area was there around the cathedral. People started settling in and around the cathedral, and it became thickly populated. And that is how it became centers of pilgrimage. So what happens when people start settling around? It became a very important place. And because of that, the church converted it into a place of pilgrimage. Faith started growing. Trust also started growing. Like that, it led to the development of towns. When people started inhabiting, when they started living around the cathedrals, towns started growing, because only with populations, towns can actually grow. Now we need to see at the next part, which is, it was actually designed. We saw also that the cathedrals were built of stone. Now, how was it designed? it was designed in such a way that the priest's voice, when the priest gave the sermon or some kind of lecture, it could be clearly heard within the wall. And so many people gathered in a cathedral. It was not like the church. So the whole voice will have to be carried all around the cathedral where number of people gathered. So monks also started singing, like singing was also there, choir was also there, beautiful voices will be heard. And it was not just heard in the place where they gathered. It used to echo. Like even now, if you go and visit a cathedral, some of them are there in India even. The construction is done in such a way that the voice gets carried over to the balcony and to the whole structure. So chiming of the voice, the chiming of the bells, everything could be heard even on the top balcony, and people even sitting at a great distance were able to clearly understand what was going inside the church. So people actually prayed with reverence. So the ambience was created. What can you understand from this? The clear ambience was created for people to enhance their trust. So are you familiar with these kind of things? It is known as a stained glass. And some of the Roman cathedrals and most of the churches have got this kind of painting and depiction, which is so beautiful. When you enter the church itself, these depicts stories from the Bible, from the Christian faith, from the saint life and all that. And it takes a fortune. Like it is not very, cheap to do these stained glass art, because only experts can do it. And of course, it was actually done in cathedrals. Okay. So stained glass was utilized for making windows, and even today when cathedrals are actually built, they will import it from the outside parts of the world, from out abroad also. And during the day, the main idea of having this stained glass is, during the day, the sunlight would make it radiant. The sunlight will fall on it, and those colors will be dispersed into the hall. It was so beautiful. It gave a very good feeling. So everything was radiating. So for people inside the cathedral, after the sunset, the light of candles would make them visible to people outside. So inside, when you're sitting in the daylight, like suppose it is morning, when you're sitting inside the church, all these colors will be dispersed into the church. But towards the end of the day, after the sunset, they will start lighting candles inside the church. So people outside can see these depictions. Outside, people who pass the church, they'll be clearly able to see this because you have candles inside. So it is a reverse process which takes place in the night or in the evening. In the morning, it is different. You have the sunlight and all the colors come into the church. But by the evening, it is the opposite thing which takes place. Did you understand? Okay. What was actually shown on the stained glass? It narrated the stories in Bible through pictures, and people who were really familiar with these stories were able to read through picture. It is known as picture reading. Like they can actually see, if suppose an entire wall is covered with a painting, you can clearly make out the story. So it is like it was communicating. It was a form of communication in those days, beautiful communication. Okay. So now there is a source from Abbot Suger, okay, about the Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris. What is he trying to say? There was an inadequacy which was really felt on feast days, because women were forced to run towards the altar upon the heads of the men with much anguish and noisy confusion to enlarge and amplify the noble church. So women were not treated properly in those days, and women were also like, they were asked to be painted by the exquisite hands of many masters from different regions. These stained glass were painted, and splendid variety of new windows came up in the cathedrals. Okay. And these windows are very valuable because so much of execution is there, so much of labor is there, and of course only cathedrals which had so much of money could afford to have stained glass. So if a particular cathedral is having stained glass, you can presume very well that it is wealthy, or the parishioners are really wealthy. Sapphire glass, and official masters and craftsmen were appointed for doing it, and there has to be a way of maintaining it also. And they will receive their allowances, namely coins from the altar and flour from the common. So from the storehouse, they will have a healthy amount of reward for doing all these things. and these people always were very particular in keeping up to the work of art. One is because of their interest in the art, and also it was very famous in those days. Okay, so that was a kind of source which we looked into, and this particular person is giving a documentation of how the stained glasses were maintained in those days inside the cathedral. Did you understand? So these sources are important because it is giving you an idea of how the social and political society of those days were, and how these things were actually painted. Now we are going to look into a crisis which came up in the 14th century. What was that? What led to the crisis? By the 14th century, Europe's economic expansion started slowing down. Gradually, when something reaches a peak, then it will have to definitely slow down. So it started slowing down after the expansion. And that was primarily because of three main factors. Let's look at the first two factors. In the northern Europe, by the end of 13th century, summers became very warm. Compared to the previous years, it was very warm, and because the summers were very warm, it gave way to bitter cold. Okay, extremes of climatic conditions can definitely change the social and economic progress of a society. So, seasons for growing crops were reduced, it was affected, and it was very difficult to grow crops on higher ground. In spite of following crop rotation, it was very difficult to grow these crops. Next reason is storms were frequent. Ocean flooding also destroyed many farmsteads. It was very difficult to have these farms, and that led to less income in taxes for governments. Storms were there, oceans were there, and because of that they did not have much taxes for the governments, and of course there was a rift between these people and the government also. So because of catastrophe, because of natural disaster, they were not able to keep up to the payment. Now the opportunities which were usually favored by the climatic conditions before the 13th century, there were a lot of opportunities which came into being because of the favorable climatic conditions, and that had actually led to large-scale reclamation of the land. So much of land came under the possession of many people, and forests and pastures were also cleared and used for agriculture. Why? Because of favorable climatic conditions. Do you think that anybody will ever buy a land if the climatic conditions were not favorable? No, no way, okay? Then the third reason is because of intensive plowing. Okay, so much of work was done on the soil in such a way that daily 24/7 everybody used to work on the soil. And because of the continuous labor on the soil got exhausted. And that was despite the practice of the 3-field rotation of crops. And clearance was not accompanied by proper soil conservation. So despite this 3-field rotation of crops, the soil got exhausted, and they were not able to conserve the soil because of all these practices. It was very difficult. Okay. Now, there was a shortage in the pasture, and that led to the reduction in the number of cattle. Pasture reduced, and that led to the reduction in the number of cattle. There was a population growth which was outstripping resources. So much of people started settling down in towns, in and around towns, and the immediate result was famine, because it was very difficult to meet the needs of all the people who came and settled. And you should remember that people from countryside and other places also started settling in and around towns. So severe famines hit Europe, especially between 1315 and 1317, and that was followed by massive cattle death. So before it struck the humans, what happened? Of course, so much of population in a particular place will first affect the animals first. When the animals are affected, the life cycle is affected, and naturally, the last person to get affected is humans. Okay, so that is what happened. So humans, when they are the cause for something, definitely it comes back to them. So trade was also hit because of that. Cattle started falling down, and trade was also hit because of the shortage of metal money. There was a shortage in the output of silver mines, because without the help of the animals and without the help of the humans, it was very difficult to carry out the process of mining in Austria and Serbia. So that forced the governments to reduce the use of silver content in currency, and they started mixing it with some cheaper metals. Did you understand? So cattle debts was there, and also another reason was because of the metal money which reduced, and of course they started using cheaper metals for the transaction process.